So it was this young man, Martin's first year away at college. And he was really close to his mother. He would call her often and tell her how things were going. He shared with her that overall things are going well. His professors were great and he was eating well. But his dorm room neighbor, the person in the room next to him, for some reason just didn't like him. He tries to be friendly to him, but he doesn't really engage back. So his mom responds, "Well, don't worry about it. Some people are just like that." Martin talks to his mom again a few days later and shares that things are still going well, but the neighbor thing is really still bothering him. The dismissiveness has now turned into dislike. He says that when he sees me in the hallway, he used to ignore me, but now he gives me the side eye, and I think he actively dislikes me. "Don't worry," his mom says. "Just ignore him, and don't let it get to you. He's probably just jealous of how well things are going for you, and you never know what may be going on in his life." A few days later, Martin talks to his mom again and says, "This neighbor situation has really taken an ugly turn." He says, "I think he really hates me now. Last night at 2 a.m, he starts to pound on the wall and yells that he hates me and wishes that I was gone." "Don't worry, Martin," says the mom. "Do not let him get to you. You just keep being you and doing what you're doing." After thinking about it for a moment, Martin responds, "Thanks, Mom. From now on, I'll just ignore him and keep playing my bagpipes." Today we continue our series, Reckless Love, Jesus' Call to Love Our Neighbor, based on the book by Tom Berlin, where we are learning to look inwards, to examine our own hearts. Tom Berlin tells us that when we identify what is in us that keeps us from properly loving our neighbor, we can find the rough edges that also keep us from loving God more fully. Because by learning how to love our neighbor, we can also grow in our love for God. And I encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to check out the previous sermons in this series, either on Facebook or on our YouTube channel. And today in chapter 5, Berlin talks about our need to really stretch our concept of who we are called to love. In it, he states that often we are guilty of dismissing others, especially those who are in need. He goes on to say that one of the easiest ways to make the commandment to love for us more manageable is to identify large groups of people to whom this commandment does not apply in our lives. And if we can reduce the number of people to whom the commandment to love applies, it gets much easier for us. And we no longer have to figure out how we will love them if we judge them not worthy of our love to begin with. Now, it's not that we are actively hating on people, but we tell ourselves that these types of people or this group of people are not worthy of our consideration, so we just ignore them. Because we often think that the opposite of love is hate. But if you think about it, when you hate someone or really, really dislike someone, at least you are still thinking about them. At least they matter enough to you to invoke some type of emotional response. But the truth is that the opposite of love is apathy and neglect. You see, every day we make choices about who is in and out of our lives, who we give our attention to. And it's generally the people that we are most comfortable with, those in our inner circles, those who we deem worthy of our attention, those who we find easy to love. But Jesus did not operate this way. His love was free of categories and distinctions. He was willing to sacrifice his reputation and comfort to prioritize those that he found in need. We find one example of this in the book of Mark. It comes from Mark chapter 5, verses 24 to 34. So let's read this together. A swarm of people were following Jesus, crowding in on him. A woman was there who had been bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a lot under the care of many doctors and had spent everything she had without getting any better. In fact, she had gotten worse. Because she had heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothes. She was thinking, if I can just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Her bleeding stopped immediately, and she sensed in her body that her illness had been healed. At that very moment, Jesus recognized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "Don't you see the crowd pressing against you? Yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus looked around carefully to see who had done it. The woman, full of fear and trembling, came forward, knowing what had happened to her. She fell down in front of Jesus and told him the whole truth. He responded, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace, healed from your disease." You see, in that time, a woman who had been bleeding would have been seen as ritually unclean. And because of how long this had been going on, she would have been in a continual state of uncleanliness, which would have caused her social and religious isolation. If she wasn't married already, this would have prevented her from getting married. If she was married, this would have prevented her from having relations, which in that time for her husband could have been seen as a grounds for divorce. And in that ancient time when a woman's livelihood was thoroughly dependent on a male, she was in a desperate situation with no prospect for a good life. So in her desperation, she came and she touched Jesus' cloak. And the passage tells us that she was immediately healed. Prior to this passage, which we didn't read, we were told that Jesus was on the way to Jairus' house to heal his daughter. Now, Jairus was a synagogue leader who was held in high regard. So on this way to this very important mission, Jesus could have ignored the fact that this vulnerable woman had just touched his cloak. He could have continued on with the crowd that must have been anticipating what Jesus was about to do in this very important person's house. But he stopped in front of everyone to talk to her. He stopped to listen to her story. I sometimes try to put myself in Jesus' place in some of these stories, and it's a very scary thing to do. Mainly because I know I'm not Jesus. But as Christians, we are called to be his disciples, to become more Christ-like, to do what Jesus would do. So I wonder in this situation, what is it that I would do? If I was on this important task to heal a synagogue leader's daughter, with this crowd following me in anticipation, I imagine I would see this as an opportunity to prove to the religious leaders, to prove to all the people that I am who I say that I am. I imagine I wouldn't want to risk my reputation and my mission by stopping to talk to someone who society viewed as unclean. But that's exactly what Jesus does. In that moment, he values that vulnerable and hurting person more than anything. In that moment, instead of ignoring or judging her, he chooses to show the crowd that no one is outside of God's love. You see, Jesus calls us to turn from gatekeepers to door openers. Those on the outskirts of society were not used to being seen as valuable. But because of what Jesus did for them, their lives were changed. He reached out to those who had no relationships, no position, no wealth. And instead of judging them or discarding them, he made it a priority to show them his love. Like some of the people of that time, we are quick to judge those based on their situation. I'm guilty of that myself. Growing up, I truly believed that if you were responsible and made good decisions, your life would turn out pretty good. And there is certainly truth to that. But because of that, I could be less empathetic to people's struggles, not as merciful or understanding as I should have been. I was blind to the fact that sometimes people's circumstances are out of their control. That like me, not everyone is born into a loving home or in a community that has proper resources. That there are many out there that were not awarded as many mistakes as I was. But I was quickly reminded that even the day I was born, when I was as vulnerable as Patrick and had nothing to offer the world, I was a recipient of someone's love. I believe I shared this with you before, but my dad came to this country to go to seminary. And it was during that time that I was born. Now, my parents were in seminary housing, and they didn't have much. My dad worked whatever jobs he could find while going to school, and my mother was in the process of going back to school. I don't believe we had health insurance at the time, so the costs of my birth were outside of my family's ability to pay for it. So soon after I was born, my dad goes back to the hospital to figure out some sort of payment plan. I don't know the exact amount, but I imagine it would have held us back quite a bit for quite a long time. But when he gets there to talk to the hospital, he's informed that somebody had already paid for it in full. They wanted it done anonymously, so to this day, we still don't know who that was. But what I do know is that when I was at my most vulnerable as a baby, someone, out of love, took care of me. Even looking back at my photo album, I was told that almost all of the clothes that I was wearing were hand-me-downs from others. And I was told by my dad multiple stories about people who didn't need to, but who offered us help when we had nothing to offer back. And I remember my dad telling me that if it was not for the fact that we already knew who Jesus was, seeing how all these people loved on us would have certainly converted him to Christ. Because that kind of extravagant love doesn't come out of nowhere. It has to have a source. As a family, we experienced the love of God at a time when we needed it. And it made all the difference in the world and shaped us, not just physically, but spiritually as well. So quickly, I see the time now. In a world that does not emphasize the vulnerable as Jesus calls us to, what steps can we take? First, turn judgment into curiosity. Like I said, too often when we encounter people we tend to dismiss, we view them with judgment. Instead of going there, cultivate a sense of curiosity. How is it that someone's life can take a certain trajectory? What happened to them that may have caused them to take a certain path? Was it something imposed on them? As in Jesus' time, we know that society can be unjust towards certain people. How has that affected their lives? If we turn judgment to curiosity, we'll likely find that things aren't what they seem. Secondly, listen with love. Take time to get to know them. Listen to their stories. Find out how it is they came to be where they are. Often we will find that what happened in their lives could have easily happened in ours, and we may not be that different after all. Third, partner with them. Often when we want to help someone, we tend to swoop in thinking that we have all the answers and exactly what they need. But what we should realize is that the person we are helping has gifts that they can also bring to the table. Things that they can do to lift themselves up out of that situation. So partner with them to find out what they truly need to get them to where they need to be. And lastly, be kind. We may not always be able to help everyone. There are times when we aren't able to do all the things we feel we should. But we can always be kind. And especially for those who haven't been loved the way they should have, a little kindness can go a long, long way. So my prayer for you and for me is that we continue to expand our capability to love like Jesus loves, to love who Jesus loves. And the more we do, the closer we can grow in our relationship with God.